Hey all, I had a request to give a kind of demonstration of what cognitive training really looks like. What does it actually mean to develop cognitive functions? How do we do it? I mean, a lot of the time, especially in the kind of more contemporary MBTI field, you'll often hear people talk about like develop your inferior function, develop this function. And even in CPT, I talk a lot about becoming well-rounded. You know, the best type is no type is the main CPT slogan. But there's often a lack of specific information about what this actually means. As many of you know, I offer cognitive coaching where I more directly give concrete applications of cognitive functions and help people train their brain, so to speak. And I have also more recently rolled out the cognitive wellness coaching, teaming up with my friend Michelle, which gives me an opportunity to team up with a doctor and employ more kind of like clinical research-backed modalities towards a typologically balanced cognition. But I did want to release a video to provide a window as to what type development actually looks like and give you all some kind of tools in order to employ in your everyday life. So let's talk about the perceptual continuums first and foremost. As you all know, probably by now, CPT tries to really concretely break down the cognitive processes, cognitive functions, if you will, into much more discrete and relatable categories. For example, extroverted sensing in CPT has got very little to do with the superficial associations within other systems. It's actually a form of attention, just as extroverted intuition is. So why not just start with extroverted sensing? If you're thinking about training this particular form of cognition, this form of perception, you're really wanting to get your cognition to be less like this and more like this as concerns the outside world. So really any kind of extended bout of concentration, any task or exercise that forces you to concentrate on a particular thing for a prolonged amount of time is going to train that particular form of perception. Now within CPT there's many different forms of extroverted sensing, and I'm not going to get bogged down into those details in this video. I mean, that's more for the coaching side of things anyway. But something that would train extroverted sensing is anything that would require a kind of attention to external detail, a kind of state of fixation upon an external source of stimulation. It could be performing a complex exercise. It could be dancing. It could be cooking. It could be maybe even plowing through an essay. If you're able to sustain and maintain your concentration upon a specific thing in the external world without getting distracted by everything around it, you're training extroverted sensing. And as for extroverted intuition, this is more about becoming aware of the context. People who lack this kind of contextual awareness might be people who are a bit more impulsive. They might speak without thinking. They might commit a blunder. They might act without truly thinking things through in the immediate sense because they're not aware of the context and therefore the implications of an action within the context. So if you're training your extroverted intuition, it's much more about becoming aware of everything going on around you, kind of de-emphasizing the part of your brain which wants to tunnel vision on a specific desired outcome and think more about, well, what are the outcomes of the situation? What are the possible different things that could happen? Ways to train this form of perception can involve just surveying the scene around you. It can be much more passive in a lot of ways. Don't worry about the whole generating multiple possibilities things. Often those particular traits of extroverted intuition, or at least what people associate with extroverted intuition, come about much later in the process. The most important thing is just to be aware of the context you are in. That's all you really need to do in order to train this form of perception. All of the other traits that people associate with it would come after that. Which is ironic, isn't it? Because people a lot of the times attribute spatial awareness to extroverted sensing. But there's two forms of spatial awareness. There's SE and NE. NE is the much more spatial form. But what about the introverted perception? Well, here things get a little bit more abstract, but they really don't need to be. If you're talking about introverted sensing, just do the same thing as you did for SE, but internally. I mean, yeah, you can do some memory stuff if you want. I don't think SI is exclusively to do with memory, but again, memory might emerge from the ability to hyperfixate upon a specific semantic value in your brain. Start trying to recall what a space looks like, or imagine an alternative space. It could be highly abstract as well. You can imagine things that don't even exist. But the more you're paying attention to the internal detail of imagination, the more you're training SI. So just train kind of recalling facts, storing information in your head, running with numbers and stuff, applying numbers more to the world around you, quantities, for example. And with your vocabulary, train being very specific with what you mean. All of this is going to train SI. And if you want to train introverted intuition, start thinking more thematically. Introverted intuition is all about internal context, and theme is a good way to represent a large portion of what internal context implies. What's this thing that I'm interested in? How can I find similarities between this thing I'm interested in and other things around me? What kind of person am I? How can I represent myself as a kind of person and compare that to other people? What kind of person is someone else compared to the kind of person that I am? Start playing around with metaphors to represent meaning. Start cultivating your own refined taste in a specific form of music, a specific form of cinema. You see, the concept of thematicism, the employment of themes across our lives, might seem abstract at first, but you will soon realize it's something everybody does on a very normal basis. Develop preferences for things. Become critical of the things that fall outside of that preference. Become exacting. Formulate the self as a concept, kind of what person am I trying to become? Identity itself is a form of NI, as attributed to an introverted feeling codec. What's this genre of music? What is the theme of the music? What is this genre of film? Employ categories across your life. Rather than allowing information to resist categories, instead try and push it into categories. And it could be categories of people, like archetypes, or it could be categories of experiences. So this is the most loosey-goosey one, but it's also, in a lot of ways, the most straightforward for the human mind. So play around with all of those forms of perception. And it's not like the kind of strategies other people suggest or the systems suggest will be wrong or inferior, but they probably wouldn't get to the very heart of what the actual cognitive process is underlying a cognitive function. And the more you can get to the very root of the problem, the better you can treat it. So now let us get to the rational elements, starting with extroverted thinking. Now in CPT, technically rational elements are assigned to perceptual elements to create higher level cognitive functions. So technically there's no such thing as TE or SE or NE, but when you pair them together, such as what I do in cognitive coaching, then you get into something much more concrete and workable. So what I'm going to tell you now about developing the rational elements, irrespective of the lens to which they were assigned, irrespective of the actual cognitive functions such as NE-TE, TE-NE, etc., is going to be a little bit more wishy-washy. But I can impart some general heuristics in order to help you get into the kind of space of these functions. And with the rational elements especially, the best way to tackle them as a kind of distinct cognitive property is to see them on the axis they reside upon. So we're actually going to focus upon TE-FI. So to train either extroverted thinking or introverted feeling, you can just hit the other side of the axis and it'll start working magic in your brain. The more you develop your introverted feeling, the more attuned you become to your own natural independent desires, the more you can actually get into a state of genuine satiation within the mind. And the more you train that introverted feeling aspect, the more outcome-oriented your thinking processes become. So a very simplistic way of looking at this is, what do I need or what do I want? Really get into that kind of process within yourself, that authentic you who does need things and is worthy of having their needs met, or even having their desires satisfied. And by training that side of yourself, you automatically free up the portion of thinking which is devoted to outcomes. What do I want to see happen here? How can I make it happen in such a way? So for extroverted thinking, just training the part of your brain which is interested in a specific outcome. A lot of the time with introverted thinking, it's not interested in outcomes, it just wants peace and harmony and for things to stay the way they're supposed to be. If you start freeing that up a little bit and seeing the world as something more chaotic, something that you can actually tear apart and then build back up with your own hands, your brain becomes a lot more attuned to outcomes. So training introverted feeling divergence is actually just forming a kind of reflexive introverted feeling that acts upon what it wants, whereas training introverted feeling convergence is more like allowing extroverted thinking to become more passive, registering what you want and what you need, but allowing those needs and desires to go unmet and adapting to a world which is not meeting them instead. And now for training the TIFE axis. This is the part of yourself which is more conservative. It's the part that wants to keep things as they are. It wants to make an excuse for why things do not need to change. It wants to regulate other people. It wants to regulate the self and say, this is ethical. These are the rules we must abide by. This is how people should behave. This is how I should behave. This is a standard of conduct that I'm going to place upon myself and upon other people. Expectations, for example. So this is much more about control and regulation than it is upon exploration and satiation. Whereas FITE wants a kind of state of satiation, satisfaction, happiness even, TIFE wants a state of peace and harmony. So if you're training the extroverted feeling part, you're training yourself to regulate your own behavior and regulate the behavior of other people. If you're training the introverted thinking part, you're talking about how things should be. You're creating rule systems. What's the appropriate thing to do next? What's the correct answer? This is independent of outcomes because, again, it's much more about keeping things the way they are, regulating things, rather than enacting a true form of change. Because as soon as change truly happens, introverted thinking becomes powerless. Introverted thinking is only powerful within a system of coherence. So you could say like progressiveness versus conservatism, not necessarily in a political sense, which are technically incorrect these days anyway, but instead in terms of your own energetic conservation, in terms of your own outlook upon life and expectations for yourself and other people. If you're more conservatively minded, you're trying to create rules and systems in order to regulate yourself and others. You're trying to understand things as they are rather than as they necessarily would be if everything suddenly flipped on its head. Whereas if you're more progressively oriented, it's more about what do I need, what do I want, what do other people want, how can we actually play around with things and treat the world more as a kind of playground that we can actually experiment upon in search of a kind of new utopia. So naturally introverted thinking, extroverted feeling is more naturally skeptical. It wants to know the actual fundamental rules and how things work. And it wants to relay that to other people to stop the world falling apart. There's nothing wrong with that. Whereas TEFI, which is a more naturally kind of childlike axis, which I mean in the best possible way, is much more about experimentation. It's learning through experience rather than pre-simulation. So if you get a few bumps along the way, it's probably worth it because then you really discover what's going on. So if I'm coaching people to develop their FITE, I want to train a sense of fearlessness within them. I want them to become accustomed to getting bumps. Whereas if I'm training someone to use TIFE, this is much more about training a sense of skepticism, getting them to hold back, getting them to think things through before they engage a particular course of action. But as I said before, these are just very fuzzy heuristics because ISTJs, for example, they tend to be very naturally skeptical people despite having the FITE axis. And types like ENTPs can definitely get themselves into trouble when they take on too many risks, and they do end up getting bumped by reality in a more kind of TEFI sense. So these aren't going to apply to absolutely everyone, but they're general heuristics you can take with you in applying a more basic 8-function model rather than a 32-function model. And this is the kind of stuff I get into with cognitive coaching. This is the kind of stuff that me and Michelle get into in the cognitive wellness service. And it's all really engaging and meaningful stuff because we're actually taking these very abstract typological conceptions and actually really bringing it down to the ground level into things that all of us already feel inside ourselves as human beings. So I hope this video is useful. If you're interested in pursuing either of these two services, definitely head over to cognitivepersonality.com. And I'll be back in a week or two. For now, take care.